Well, it's a great pleasure now to introduce the Revd Dr Patrick Richmond, who is Vicar of Christ Church Eton in Norwich. He was formerly Dean of St Catherine's College here in Cambridge. I had the great privilege of studying simultaneously with Patrick when we were theological students in Oxford. We both read theology and trained for ordination in the Church of England together, which was a great time, I have to say. And we've remained friends ever since then. Patrick has a big interest in science and religion, and in particular he's interested also in philosophy of religion, and the compatibilist idea of free will as opposed to libertarian free will. I think there's still a book on the way about that, isn't there?
Deeply involved.
So he was a curate in Leicester before coming back to Cambridge to take up that post, which he's had. You were here about 6 years, was it? 6 years. Great. And now just appointed to the job in Norwich. So we have the topic of God's complexity, taking on Richard Dawkins, or maybe taking his side. Who knows?
Yes, it is that man again. And hearing some of the questions, I could see that he may appear a bit of a dead dog, but I think that the argument that is behind the is God complex question is the argument that Richard Dawkins gives in the God Delusion book as the central argument, the reason why there almost certainly is no God. And just to follow on from what Dennis was saying earlier, I think for Dawkins you've got to see the argument that God is a virus of the mind being spread in the context of his prior belief that there is almost certainly no God. So anything that is spreading the belief that there is a God is evil precisely for the reason that it's spreading a false belief. So if you're a really serious intellectual like Richard Dawkins, who tells us that he gets out of bed every morning animated by his desire to find out more scientifically about the world, then anything like God is dulling people's minds and spreading false beliefs. So it's a virus from that perspective. It's from the perspective of there being almost certainly no God. And why is there almost certainly no God? Well, Richard Dawkins is following in a serious intellectual tradition, but he's putting a particular spin on this argument. He's arguing that an intelligent designer would have to be more complex than his creatures. He'd have to be very complicated, and he would therefore need more explanation than he can provide. And what's more, not only is he an absolutely rubbish explanation, a complex God is extremely improbable in itself. The idea wears its improbability on its face when you add just a few thoughts that Richard Dawkins is going to provide. So this argument is the centre of the God delusion, but you can see it playing a sort of a walk-on part and setting the scene at least as far back as his book, The Blind Watchmaker. So what I'm going to do in this talk is attempt to clarify the argument and bang it into your heads at least 3 times. I'm going to offer an overview of various responses to the argument that I've seen in the literature and explain to you why I think, for various reasons and with varying degrees of severity, all these responses fail miserably. And I'm going to offer an argument of my own that God need not involve unexplained complexity after all. And you may find that severely wanting as well, but we can talk about that. So that's what I'm going to try and do in my hour or so. So the term complexity covers a multitude of sins. The idea of complexity, like the idea of simplicity, is a complex notion. But when you've read Richard Dawkins' corpus, you can see that he has a certain sort of complexity very much in mind. What sort of complexity is that? Well, it's the sort of complexity you find in living organisms like ourselves, that you find in watches, and that you find in Boeing 747s, which you can see on the slide. This sort of complexity involves having many different parts. You can see the different parts of the 747. You can see that I've got many different parts. And what's special about them is they're specifically organised for function. So The Boeing 747's wheels are on the bottom. It has wings on either side and jet engines under those wings that point in the right direction for it to fly. And you can see that that's just beginning to skim the surface of the way the many different parts are specifically organised for function. And this arrangement of parts is improbable. Dawkins wants us to realise that it's deeply improbable that we should find these parts in this way. Now, some of you may have come across the writings of Alistair McGrath, and in his book Dawkins' God, he accuses Dawkins of making some sort of Kierkegaardian leap of faith in moving from complexity to improbability. And I don't think that that's a fair charge if you read all of Dawkins' work, because, for example, in The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins explains that the sort of improbability he's worried about is statistical improbability, and that's the number of ways that something could be the case compared with the specific way that's in focus. And Dawkins is pointing out that the number of ways of getting life and function compared with the number of possible ways of arranging the parts is extremely low. The number of ways you could organise the parts of the Boeing 747 that wouldn't do anything useful, that wouldn't be well adapted to long-haul flights around the world, is vastly greater than the number of ways you could arrange the parts so that the thing takes off, flies around and lands properly. And Dawkins says that you can see that the same is true of living organisms. So however many ways there may be of being alive, says Dawkins, it's certain that there are vastly more ways of being dead, or rather not alive. So the sort of complexity that Dawkins has in mind leads to a definition in terms of statistical improbability. Dawkins is defining complexity as a statistically improbable arrangement of parts. That's what he means by organised complexity. So it's a term of art. It's something that Dawkins is defining for the sake of his argument, which is basically driven by his attention to biology, but can be applied in other fields. So what it says at the top of that mysteriously hidden and obscure theological statement is organised complexity needs an explanation, says Richard Dawkins. So what sort of complexity? This organised complexity we find in organisms and in artefacts. And random chance is an implausible explanation when the statistical improbability is very high. Why is that? Well, it's almost by definition. If it's incredibly improbable that you'll get that particular arrangement which works compared with a vast number that don't work, then it's bizarrely improbable to think that it's just a matter of random arrangement that's given you the exact arrangement of parts that works, that lives, that flies, that functions. So Dawkins says throwing cells together at random for 1 billion years wouldn't produce anything like a living organism. Clearly, we are not arranged by random chance. You'd never get anything as well adapted for life as us, just by a random arrangement. And so there's the famous quote from Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, "A hurricane blowing through a junkyard won't assemble a jumbo jet. The arrangement of the jumbo jet's part is just far too improbable for it to have come about as a random arrangement by chance." So organised complexity needs an explanation. And sorry about these slides, should have checked it because it all looked fine when I looked at the first one. Human designers, that says, can produce organised complexity. So there is an obvious analogy, says Dawkins, between biological organisms and products of human design, that you really can look at the workings of a living thing and be reminded of the workings of an artefact, maybe like some watch found on a heath. Maybe you've heard of Paley's watchmaker argument, which Dawkins is specifically targeting in the Blind Watchmaker book. And Archdeacon Paley had influenced Darwin. Archdeacon Paley said if you came across a watch lying on a heath, you'd be instantly struck by an impression that this is a designed object. And then Paley tries to show that the same is true, only vastly more so, of any living organisms you come across. And so this is the basis from the argument from design in the living biological world. So there's Archdeacon Paley. And Dawkins is giving him a run for his money. But of course, Paley was pre-Darwin. Dawkins thinks that God is now rendered superfluous. We don't need that hypothesis to explain biological complexity, because Darwinism explains biological complexity. And most of the blind watchmaker is concentrating on showing that it is indeed a plausible explanation. In the God delusion, Dawkins is aware, to a greater degree, I think, than he was earlier, that you need to offer some more account of how it is that things are set up for evolution to occur. So how does life begin, for example? And Dawkins makes some sort of appeal to the literally billions of opportunities it would seem that there are in the universe for life to get going. So even if you think that the chance of life getting going is only 1 billion to 1, well, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and each of those has billions of planets. So Dawkins doesn't think it's at all improbable. But for there to be galaxies, for there to be anything like our universe, you need very particular fundamental constants of physics, and I believe that you've already had a talk on the anthropic fine-tuning. Dawkins is aware of that, and he appeals instead to a multiverse. There could be trillions of universes, so the improbability of finding one of the universes with the right values isn't low. Dawkins is aware you're going to say, but that sounds very complicated, doesn't it? Well, Dawkins is saying, no, it's not complicated in the sense that I mean. I'm talking about organised complexity, all these parts being arranged in a very specific way. And a multiverse doesn't involve that very same sense of complexity, at least Dawkins thinks so. If you're going to motivate the argument, you need to show that there's some sort of improbability about the multiverse. And Dawkins doesn't think there is. We could talk about that more, but you need to be aware that Dawkins is saying there isn't organised complexity in the multiverse, but there is in biology and in artefacts. So what of the designer? Well as being useless, appeal to design is futile, thinks Dawkins, because a designer is more in need of explanation than the things he designs. If you look around us, we're all capable of designing things, but we're all incredibly complicated. We're all in need of some sort of explanation for our organised complexity. And so Dawkins says, any designer capable of constructing the dazzling array of living things would have to be intelligent and complicated beyond all imagining. And complicated is just another word for improbable, well, organised complexity is, and therefore demanding of explanation. So God would be the ultimate 747. You need some explanation of God's complexity. You haven't solved the problem, you've just pushed it back, and you've made it worse. So appeal to design is futile, thinks Dawkins. And he's not original in thinking that. Even though I think that Richard Dawkins' presentation of the argument is spun in a scientific direction and isn't philosophically top drawer, he is arguing in an important tradition which has influenced a lot of the intellectual climate. This is David Hume, famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, seen as a skeptic, but also as perhaps one of the beginnings of an attempt to offer a naturalistic explanation of the world and of all there is. And Hume says that order in the mind of God is just as much as need of explanation as order in the material world. So Hume doesn't use the language of complexity, he uses the language of order, but it's occurring in a discussion of biological organisms. So the sort of order he's worried about is this organisation of all the parts to produce something that functions, that lives, that works, that has its being. And in a very famous work of Hume's, published posthumously, probably because Hume realised what a stink it would cause, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Hume stages an argument between someone who is defending an argument from design in the natural world, called Cleanthes, and Philo, who's a sceptical character whose views seem to be uncannily like those of David Hume expressed elsewhere. And Philo says, comparing a mental world, the world inside your mind, to a sort of universe of ideas, Philo says it's not easy, I own, to see what is gained by this supposition of a designer God. What's gained by it? Because after all, a mental world or universe of ideas requires a cause as much as does a material world or universe of objects, and if similar in its arrangement, must require a similar cause. So you've got an arrangement of ideas in your mind, and you're using that to explain the arrangement of things in the physical world. But then, says Hume, well, how has that helped? Because you haven't explained the arrangement of ideas in your mind, have you? You've just pushed it back. So Hume says, well, it seems that the designer needs a designer now, and that's going to lead on to an infinite regress of designers. And so Philo says, well, the sooner you stop that regress and just settle with the natural world, the better. So this might seem to be raising the question of who designed God, a question that Dawkins, of course, quotes. But it seems to me that religious believers, when they hear the question, who designed God, take it as, there is a God, and the question is, well, who designed him? Well, obviously that's absurd, isn't it? Nobody thinks that. When a skeptic or an atheist is asking who designed God, they're saying, well, you've got a serious problem. If you're saying we need to explain the natural world, we're saying, well, you need to explain God. You're no better off. So the skeptic is not saying that there is a God and we need to explain his design. He's saying that there's something distinctly fishy and unhelpful about this idea. So Hume is sceptical of the argument from design, and many people, including many theologians, would see that Hume is at the basis of the rot in natural theology, the attempt to argue honestly from the natural world to belief in God. So Hume and Kant are often seen as the sort of tag team that beat up on natural theology. But Hume doesn't offer a convincing alternative explanation of organised complexity. Hume was pre-Darwin. He comes amazingly close. He has a God who has many attempts, or maybe a community of gods all making botched productions and getting slowly better. He talks about mechanical processes. He talks about the fact that only some systems might be organised in such a way that they can propagate. So they'll be the only ones you find. So he's got a lot of the ideas that Darwin would later synthesise, but he never gets there. So, as Dennett says, Hume folds. He doesn't offer a better alternative. But, of course, post-Darwin, Dawkins can say that Darwinism can explain organised complexity. So we now have the Holy Grail, because evolution by natural selection leads to the accumulation of simple, easy mutations that aren't too improbable in the population. And the beneficial mutations will accumulate while the deleterious ones will be eliminated. And that's how you get this step-by-step production of the right organisation for life and function. We have the explanation. So eventually complex organisms are going to arise out of simple beginnings. You don't need to start with something complex and organised. You can start with something simple and build up from there. So Darwinism doesn't commit this terrible fallacy of assuming what it needs to explain. So Darwin has done what Hume never quite managed. So Dawkins thinks that thanks to Darwin, there can be intellectually fulfilled atheists. That can be misunderstood, but what I think Dawkins is saying is that, yes, Hume did a lot to show that atheism was, in some sense, intellectually tenable. But it wasn't satisfying intellectually. There was no real explanation for the amazing organised complexity we find. But Darwin provided the explanation. So Darwinism explains the appearance of design in nature by something that doesn't involve design. It is true that we look designed. It is true that organisms are fantastically impressive. But Darwinism shows that that is an illusion, an entirely understandable illusion. It may well have been reasonable to be, in some sense, a theist before Darwin, but it's certainly not reasonable now. What we're looking for now, thinks Dawkins, following Daniel Dennett, is natural cranes, not divine skyhooks. Natural cranes, not divine skyhooks. So a skyhook is something that has no real explanation of what it's hanging off. What we want to do is have something that's solidly based in physical reality. We want a crane to do our explanatory heavy lifting. We need to explain these things, and we need to explain them in terms of things that are well-founded. whereas the appeal to God is a skyhook, ill-founded. It trails off into some obscurity. So the theory of evolution, thinks Dawkins, is the only theory we know of that's in principle capable of explaining the existence of organised complexity. This is the only theory that's really doing the intellectual work, starting with non-organised complexity and producing organised complexity. It's the only theory we know of. On the other hand, design can never be the ultimate explanation. It's only an approximate explanation. Dawkins isn't denying that human beings designed 747s, but that's only because human beings themselves were designed, or apparently designed, by cumulative evolution and natural selection. So it's a double whammy. We have got an explanation in terms of Darwinism, and design is only a placeholder. It requires further explanation. So Darwinism provides the crane, and God is the skyhook. But it's worse than just the failure of God as an explanation. Dawkins thinks that God is not just superfluous, as Darwin has explained. Dawkins thinks God is not just useless, as Hume argued. Dawkins is arguing, in addition, God is statistically improbable in his own right. He needs an explanation he can't have. So let's just talk a bit more about that. Dawkins is saying that the argument from design, when you understand it, actually backfires. It blows the hands off the theist who tries to use it. The argument for design, after all, is saying that you need an explanation of organised complexity. It's extremely improbable that this arrangement of parts would arise by chance. You need an explanation. But the problem is God has vastly more complexity than nature, and God's complexity is unexplained by hypothesis. It wouldn't be God if he was somehow explained by something else. So God is extremely improbable. He's an arrangement of parts, he's organised, he's got an arrangement of ideas that requires explanation but doesn't have one. In other words, he's improbable. Is that reasonably clear, or am I just ranting? Okay, let's keep going. So, there's no explanation for God's complexity. Let's just rub that in. Well, traditionally God wasn't designed. That's why the who designed God question sounds so odd when a believer hears it. And traditionally God didn't evolve. Now he's always got to have been perfect and just right for creation. And random chance is no explanation because the improbability is extreme. The chance of it arising by random processes is incredibly low. That's what we mean by organised complexity. So there's no explanation for God's extremely improbable complexity. It's a non-starter. So what difference does Darwin make? Again, Alistair McGrath seems to me to be accusing Dawkins of moving quickly from Darwinism to atheism. And I don't think that's fair, actually. I think that Dawkins is offering an argument that God is improbable even without Darwin. You don't actually need the Darwinian premises to see that there's something fishy about an unexplained, highly complex arrangement of parts or ideas. Okay, it actually follows from the definitions. So, in some ways, Dawkins is offering an a priori argument against the probability of God. It doesn't depend on Darwin. It's not that scientific an argument. On the other hand, Dawkins does think that Darwin makes a big difference, probably because it boosts the plausibility and tenability and fulfillment that an atheist can have. So before Darwin, we've got no explanation. So God may seem pretty improbable, but we're stuck with something that's fantastically improbable, life on Earth. So we might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. And Hume's Philo, as we said, admits that the cause of nature probably bears some remote analogy to intelligence. So Philo, this wonderful skeptic, in the end seems to be coming out with a sort of no contest type verdict. So things have changed. Darwinism has impressed people with the power of natural explanations. In the past we might have gone running for an explanation in terms of God when we got into difficulty, but since this amazing breakthrough of Darwin's, we are wiser. We've had our consciousness raised of the power of dumb matter to produce fantastically fancy things like us, or at least like Richard Dawkins. So, we've got a powerful natural explanation of organised complexity, And we can see that intelligence and mind arise naturally, but only at the end of a long evolutionary process. So if you've deeply drunk at the well of Darwinism, you're going to find the idea of an intelligence that sits there from time immemorial, deeply unscientific. But I emphasise, Dawkins' argument doesn't seem to me to depend on Darwinism. It actually works a priori. Is that reasonably clear? I'm preaching to the converted. So, another point to make is that God is improbable however he's supposed to create. Now obviously what really gets Richard Dawkins' goat is all these creationists who are stopping the true gospel of Darwinism being spread. So Dawkins goes into battle with them with a vengeance, but this can make the intellectually sophisticated theists sit back in a false sense of complacency. Oh, well, of course we know about Darwinism. Of course we know that Genesis isn't literal. Don't be like those sort of rednecks out in the United States. But Dawkins' argument is essentially that God is improbable whatever he does. Even if he doesn't do anything, you can see that God is demanding an explanation he can't have. So all of this sort of Neville Chamberlain school of making peace between science and God is beside the point. God is a great big monstrosity intellectually, however he's supposed to do anything. So the argument at heart is a problem for belief in a complex, intelligent God. So God is improbable whichever way you cut it. So let me just drive this home, that we really have got a difference of emphasis at the very least. So Hume's point is that God doesn't seem to be really any help. Darwin's point is that here we've got something that does the job, evolution. And Dawkins' point is, in addition to those, that God would have to be improbable in himself. So I think that Dawkins' main argument, when you've picked it over, is something like this. God would involve organised complexity. That's an obvious premise. God's organised complexity would be unexplained. That follows from the definition of God. So God's existence involves organised complexity existing unexplained from 1 and 2. But premise, agreed on by the argument from design, it's extremely improbable that organised complexity should exist unexplained. So, from 3 and 4, God's existence is extremely improbable, which is to say, there's almost certainly no God. Well, obviously, there's a big question, why think God is complex? And Dawkins doesn't fully explain. He obviously thinks that it's obvious, but of course it isn't obvious what's obvious. Is it obvious or plausible? Well, I think you've got to break that question down to at least these things. Is it obvious or plausible to dyed-in-the-wool faith heads? Well,
you better explain that.
That's someone like me.
Can you explain that for people who may not understand that phraseology?
Right. This is a quote from the God Delusion, which is full of olive branches like this, attempting to make peace between religion and science. So I take a dyed-in-the-wool faith head to be someone who's been so imbued in religious life and argument that they actually take seriously the idea of God, even in the face of the obviously superior arguments of Richard Dawkins. So dyed-in-the-wool faith heads, obviously they're not going to be impressed. And I think some of them won't be impressed because they couldn't care less. And I've heard well-educated, intelligent theists who are quite happy to admit that God is complicated. So that's one form, but others I think won't be impressed for reasons that I'll go on to. What about open-minded thinkers? Well, I tried this out on theology applicants for Cambridge. Last term, when the God Delusion came out, I was interviewing people applying for theology. I think that a lot of these people did think there was something worth arguing about. They didn't think it was a knockdown argument, but they certainly thought there was something clever there. And I think there's a question, is it obvious to dyed-in-the-wool materialists? If you've deeply imbued a naturalistic approach to life, explaining things in terms of the interaction of parts, then I think this argument will actually be very plausible. Well, why do I think that? Well, because there are at least 4 ways in which God might seem complex. At least. You may be able to think of some others, and I'd be delighted to hear them at the end of the questions. But one, and I think this will be appealing to anybody who's a naturalist at heart and used to doing neuroscience and pursuing what's sometimes called the strong program of artificial intelligence, which is trying to explain consciousness in terms of the functioning of the mind, of the brain, as something like a computer or an algorithmic engine. If you think that, then it's pretty obvious that anything that has consciousness is going to be complex. As Dennis was saying earlier, if you think that consciousness is some sort of emergent property, emerging out of our brains, well, it's obvious you don't have consciousness, which God has, unless you've got some underlying structure that it emerges from, that it supervenes on, that realizes. So if you think that, that's pretty obvious. I think that's a slam dunk. But a lot of people won't think that that's obvious for God. But I think they'll still be troubled by the fact, as Dawkins says, anything that designs has to be at least as complicated as a thing designs. Why might he think that? Well, I think it's probably because there's an idea in the head. Or because there are complex ideas of possible creations. God's got all of these ideas of things he could create in his head, and all of them are complicated, organised complexity. And then, if you just think about the sheer scope of God's imagination, it's infinite. Each of these ideas existing in the mind of God would seem to be even more complicated than Dawkins' multiverse. So let's just look at this in a bit more detail. Complex correlates of consciousness, I've called this one. The preacher often goes for the alliteration. Dawkins does mention brains and central processing units, and I've got the central processing unit here. You can see how fantastically complicated that is, and of course that doesn't do even 1/1,000,000th of what our brain does in terms of making connections. And it seems that animal and artificial intelligence requires colossal complexity. In the past, people might have thought that the thinking was being done by a ghost in the machine. But now we can see that even if there is a ghost in the machine, it's completely dependent on the machinery. So it seems very plausible, if you're thinking empirically, that consciousness requires complexity. We never find the one without the other. Funny that. Let's go on to the more intellectual and idealist ones. Complex knowledge of creation. God's idea of creation is improbable as the creation itself, says Dawkins. And I think what he's thinking of is that there's something like creation in God's mind, God's idea of creation, and it must be specifying creation perfectly. So it must be as complicated, mustn't it? And God, in addition to that, knows himself. And that leads us on to the problem of the complex ideas of possible creations. So in addition to his idea of the actual creation, the designer must have all the possible creations he could have made. So here we've got the chimera, created out of different parts of animals. So God must have every single combination of every single possible thing, mustn't he? So that means that God has got an infinite regress of ideas, all of them deeply complicated, all of them crying out for an explanation we can't have. And finally, following David Hume, if we see God's mind as a sort of universe of ideas, then you've got an infinite number of ideas, and that violates Occam's razor with a vengeance. That argument doesn't require any of the sort of fine definitions that Dawkins has used. I think that's an appeal to Occam's razor, which Dawkins does sometimes seem to have in mind, but it's not to the fore. As I say, to the fore is his idea of organised complexity. So I hope I've done enough to motivate the idea that God's complexity looks plausible. Nod if you think it's beginning to look a bit plausible. Some people aren't impressed, but... Okay. So how might theists respond? How do theists respond? Well, here are three ways that I think I perceive. One is to say that for some reason no explanation of God is needed. You can wave away that question in some way. Another response, which is deeply rooted in the tradition, which is why some dyed-in-the-wool faith tales will quickly whip it out, is that the designer exists of necessity. We'll come on to what that means. And finally, you can go head-to-head and say, no, God's simple, not complex. And again, that is part of traditional theology. So if we're going to say that we're going to wave away the request for an explanation of God, we could point out, well, aha, to Cockway, you also can't explain everything. Darwinism doesn't explain everything. And even Dawkins will admit that the question why there's a lawful fine-tuned physics allowing evolution to occur is a question that he doesn't think there's a good answer to yet. And also, as Dennis was mentioning, there's the hard problem of consciousness, not the easy problem of finding correlations between brain states and ideas, but the hard problem of explaining why there are any ideas associated with brain states at all. So why are there subjective conscious experiences in this objective physical world? And Dawkins thinks that that is a serious problem, but he thinks that scientists will probably solve it, and at least they should assume that they will. And I think the problem is more severe than Dawkins is giving credit, because we're dealing with a conceptual gap. Most scientific problems occur in the physical world, and we have at least some grasp of what it is for an object to be extended in space and time. But we have much less grasp on what a conscious idea is, still less of how it could be related to a physical object. There's a conceptual chasm that yawns there that many philosophers think may befuddle us forever, that this is going to be mysterious to eternity. And though, of course, science has a tremendous track record of closing in gaps, it doesn't have a track record of closing in gaps from the subjective to the objective. We do seem to be in a different sort of ball game. So extrapolation from the past success of science may be an illegitimate and hasty generalization to a new field. So Darwinism plausibly doesn't explain everything. But that isn't the problem. It doesn't help. The main problem is that God is organised and complex and needing an explanation. Even if Dawkins can't explain everything, well, we're in a worse position if we believe in God. We can't explain those things, and we've got God sticking out like a sore thumb, requiring an explanation he can't have. So we need to solve the problem of the complex God. It's no good just saying, you've got problems as well. We've got a worse problem, thinks Dawkins. There's almost certainly no God. Well, another strategy would be to point out that suppose astronauts are digging away on Mars and they find a pure titanium cube. Okay? Now, not surprisingly, some astronauts say, alien intelligence. Obviously they've built this, it didn't evolve after all. But others say, oh no, you can't explain those aliens, you don't know how they did it, we couldn't make a cube like that. You haven't explained it. Well, pretty clearly we'd prefer the alien intelligence explanation to the, it's an unexplained cube. So maybe we could say, well, here's the universe, it's got some things we'd like to explain, we'll invoke God, we don't need to explain that, just as we didn't need to explain the alien intelligence. But the difference is the alien designers aren't unexplained in principle, a natural explanation is possible. It's Darwinism. God is unexplained in principle. So, even though that has some illustrious defenders, I don't think it works. Another response is that God isn't an explanatory theory. So, the point here is that typically believers aren't believing in God as if he were some scientific hypothesis. And indeed, there are other modes of knowing that religious believers typically appeal to. So there's Calvin's sense of divinity, faith in the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit, belief in testimony from Scripture and from other believers. So we're not basing our belief on God as some sort of scientific hypothesis. How crass. No, we've got other ways of knowing, so we can just dismiss your argument, Professor Dawkins. Well, I don't think that works, because God's positively improbable, remember? The claim that organised complexity demands an explanation is independently plausible. Even if you haven't made any mention of explanation to date in your case for God, I think it's legitimate to ask how there can be such a peculiarly improbable arrangement of ideas as we seem to have with God. At the very least. And so, if you appeal to faith, it seems that that faith is in tension with some fairly plausible elements of reason. And indeed, Dawkins is often accusing faith of being a willingness to believe things without evidence or even in the teeth of evidence. And again, I think theologians can rightly point out that that definition of faith isn't the mainstream faith. definition of faith. But most theologians have thought that faith is far more reasonable than Dawkins is giving credit. That's what they say, but look what they do. When the going gets tough, suddenly you get these appeals to bare faith without any reason. And that backs Dawkins up. Another common appeal is, God's got no beginning. And Dawkins does sometimes write as if the question is, well, where did God come from? Or how do you explain the origin of the designer? Clearly, that's crass, but Dawkins is aware of the claim that God has no beginning. It's just that he thinks it's facile, thinks it's too easy. Doesn't explain anything to say that God has no beginning. Suppose you come across some alien Jumbo 747 in space. Some people say that it needs an intelligent designer. Other people say, oh no, it's always existed. We don't need to explain it. I think you dismiss that explanation. And indeed, it looks like Dawkins is onto something, because Christian arguments for God, when presented with the idea that the universe might always have existed, have often said, even if the universe has always existed, you still need an explanation for why the universe is as contingent, as complicated, as apparently designed as it is. So, appeal to God's eternity and no beginning, again, looks to me to miss the point. An explanation does look like it's needed. So, perhaps God is not unexplained, but necessary. And the idea of necessity is slightly obscure and has its origins in pre-Socratic philosophy, but it means something like God cannot fail to exist. There may be some other things that are necessary, think some of the ancient philosophers, but certainly God is something that can't fail to exist. Always and everywhere you'll get God. And Dawkins doesn't discuss this much, and I think that's a failing in comprehensiveness of his treatment. But he does discuss the ontological argument which is linked to it. Indeed, the idea that God can't fail to exist may well be logically derivable from the idea that God is all-powerful, because if God has power over everything, he must exist in every situation. If he didn't exist, he couldn't have power over that situation. And likewise, it seems plausible that a God who can't fail to exist is more perfect or greater in some way than a God who could fail to exist. Dawkins does discuss the ontological argument and thinks it's rubbish, and we'll come on to that in a bit. But it does seem plausible, to me at least, that necessary existence follows from the concept of God and not from the concept of nature. So the idea of an unexplained God, that seems a truism, a tautology, true by the concepts. But unexplained nature, well, you've actually discovered something at the very least. That's a synthetic proposition, something that's been made out of things that may not be the case. So maybe God's looking like he's got a bit of a head start. Let's look at that. Well, there are two ways we could try and spell out how God cannot fail to exist. What's that cannot doing? Well, it could just be that in the deep structure, the metaphysics of reality, God's existence is the final stopping point. He's uncaused and causes everything else, and that's just the way it is. God can't fail to exist because he's the cause of everything, and he never comes into existence or goes out. That seems to me to make some sense. Dawkins probably thinks that physics, or fundamental physics, is necessary in that sense. But it doesn't explain why a complex God exists the way he does. Because organised complexity doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that we should be happy to just postulate like that and say, oh, it's just the way it is. It just happens to be the one way that's so fantastically productive rather than the other ways. So factual necessity makes sense, but it doesn't explain very much. The stronger claim is that God is logically necessary, which means roughly that God's non-existence ultimately doesn't make sense. Now this view has links to the ontological argument, the idea that by reflecting on the concept of God alone, you might see that there is a God, because you can see that God's non-existence doesn't make sense, then you've realised that there's got to be a God. And it's also attractive in the cosmological argument. If you ask, why is there anything at all, anything concrete, worlds or spirits, angels, you could answer that by saying, well, it's impossible for there to be nothing because God's got to exist. It's part of the idea of God, if you understand it properly, that God exists. God has existence like a triangle has 3 angles. So the problem with this is that at least since Immanuel Kant, this idea of logical necessity has been out of favour, and Hume attacks it and is prepared to just rest the whole argument on it seeming wrong and non-empirical. And certainly it does seem that usually logical necessity is a feature of abstract things like numbers and logical laws, not concrete things. It might be odd to see God as made of concrete, but it doesn't mean that. It means that he's a real being out there and not dependent on our mind or the way we think or speak. And Kant says something that seems to be suggesting that existence isn't a normal predicate. It's not the sort of thing that can go in a definition. You can say that a brick is heavy or it's red, but if you say a brick is or is existent, you're not saying the same sort of thing. It's a different sort of logical move. And if existence isn't a normal predicate, then it can't be part of the definition of God, and it becomes deeply problematic to explain what a logically necessary God is meant to be. Now, these arguments are not clear and decisive, and Alvin Plantinga, for example, offers a complex philosophical semantics of possible worlds to try and make sense of God being a necessary being. But I think, given the sort of provenance of Richard Dawkins, and anybody who's got an empirical inclination, who wants to look and see what the world is really like rather than just sort it all out from their armchair, is going to find these ideas suspicious in the extreme. There's something fishy about a logically necessary God. And even if you're prepared to say that it makes sense, doesn't it seem logically possible that there be no God? Isn't atheism at least in the running? At least nowadays, I think most people say it is. And doesn't it seem logically possible that there is evil that God would not allow? That's at least possible. We can understand what it would be like for there to be infinite torture of the innocent going on in extreme pain. That doesn't look to be the sort of thing God would create, and yet it seems logically possible. In fact, some people think that the evil that we see is incompatible with God, and I don't think they'd be very persuaded if you said, oh no, it's logically impossible for there to be no God, so this evil can't be too extreme. That would seem a very odd way of arguing to most people. So if you're prepared to let the logical possibility of God's non-existence, or something that implies God's non-existence, into the door, it seems you've got to conclude that God's existence isn't logically necessary. Now, that's probably gone off the philosophical deep end, so are there any nods about it's roughly clear what I'm saying? Yeah, a few nods there, so the rest sleep easy. So let's go on to the claim that God is simple, not complex. And this is traditional. It's expressed in medieval creeds, no less, like the Fourth Lateran Council, First Vatican Council, and even Protestant creeds, like the Westminster Confession or the 39 Articles of the Church of England, say that God has no body nor parts. And if God has no parts, then arguments based on improbable arrangements of parts are irrelevant. They can't get off the ground. So this looks like it is a direct attack. Now, the medieval accounts of divine simplicity are problematic. So famous theologians like Augustine, we've had him earlier, Anselm of the ontological argument, St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, probably the most influential Roman Catholic theologian, they hold that God is not only not composed of parts, he's so simple, he's identical with his properties, and indeed identical with his existence. So he's really simple, he's radically simple. And the problem is when you try and spell that out philosophically, it doesn't make much sense. So if God is identical with his properties, he's identical with his omniscience, then it would seem that God is omniscience. But omniscience is an abstract term, it's not a real thing. So God, surely a real thing, not an abstract thing. Now, you can make more sense of this when you realise that the medievals are working with a different metaphysical style, a different way of cutting up reality. But this way of cutting up reality is often seen as obsolete. The way that we cut things up into abstract and real, most philosophers think has got a lot more going for it. So this sounds odd. Philosophers at the time realised it needed explanation, And probably, in modern climates, it's deeply improbable and implausible. And there's another problem, which I'll just advert to. Let's say that God is identical with his omniscience. There's no distinction between God and his omniscience, what he knows. But if God is necessary and can't be different, then that seems to mean that God's knowledge can't be different. But God's knowledge must be different if he's to take into account his own freedom. He could do one thing or another, and we can do one thing or another, many people think. So, again, there seem to be serious logical problems for the medieval doctrine of simplicity. So though Dawkins doesn't discuss it, I think he's within his rights to say that doesn't look very promising. Richard Swinburne is one of the most influential philosophers of religion working today. He's the emeritus professor of the philosophy of the Christian religion at Oxford. And Swinburne's initial work was in philosophy of science. And Swinburne argues from science and from our practices of explanation generally that it seems that we prefer simpler theories, other things being equal. They seem to be more probable, other things being equal. So if you've got a complex theory and a simple theory and they both explain the evidence just as well, which would you believe? You'd probably believe the simpler one. And Swinburne says simple theories have few logically independent entities of few kinds. So if you want a simple explanation of something, it'll have, say, only a few fundamental particles of a few kinds. And if that can explain all of the data of atoms, then that would be better than one that postulates lots. And likewise, these things should have few properties of few kinds. So if you can explain these atomic data by fundamental particles which have just a few properties that, rather than many, that would be better too. You'd go for the simpler. And Swinburne says in addition that we want, when we're explaining things, properties that are more readily experienced, that we're more familiar with, rather than ones that are harder to experience or define. And he gives an obscure example of that, which I won't go into now. You could ask me later if you want me to go into. I don't think it's too important. He also says that infinite numbers of entities are not simple. That seems fairly intuitive, that if you've got infinite number of universes, that would be more complicated than a finite number of universes. But limitless amounts of a property or a value are simpler than large finite ones. The example Swinburne gives is that when Newtonian science ruled and people were thinking about optics, they could see that light went very fast. And Swinburne says they thought that the idea that light was instantaneous, that it had infinite velocity, seemed simpler than that light had some finite value. Well, why? Well, it's harder to explain why that value rather than some other. And you have to ask the question, why that value? Which doesn't arise if there's an infinite value, no limit. So that's what Swinburne thinks simplicity comprises on. So he then argues that God is simple, or God's just one entity, and he can be simply specified in terms of limitless intentional power. Intentional power is what you do by intending and choosing, and it's something that we experience intimately. We're all aware of being conscious, or at least I am, I don't know about you. A limitless amount of power is simpler to define than a large finite amount. You don't have to explain why God's got that amount rather than some other, because he's got an infinite amount. So far, so simple. And limitless intentional power requires limitless knowledge. If there was some gap in God's consciousness, it would mean that he couldn't exercise that power. His power would be limited, but he's got limitless power. And if God knows the value of everything and has the power to achieve it, and there are no limits on his power, then he'll go for that. So he'll be limitlessly good. He won't ever be distracted or do things that are irrational. And limitless power implies that he's ultimate. He doesn't depend on anything else, so he's factually necessary by definition. So, Swinburne thinks that God is simple. Dawkins reviews one of Swinburne's books, his more popular books, and came out with this quote, which is repeated pretty much word for word in The God Delusion. A God capable of continuously monitoring and controlling the individual status of every particle in the universe isn't going to be simple. Worse, from the point of view of simplicity, other corners of God's giant consciousness are simultaneously preoccupied with the doings and emotions and prayers of every single human being, and all those aliens. So Dawkins isn't impressed It's not clear, however, what exactly the argument is here. It does look more like assertion than explanation. As I've said, I think there could be at least 4 things behind that. And Swinburne interprets what Dawkins is saying on his website in terms of the complex correlates of consciousness problem. Remember, that was the idea that behind every great mind is a great brain. Okay? But Swinburne won't have any of that, because Swinburne, unfashionable that he is a mind-body dualist. So he does believe that mind and brain are radically different things, and that the mind, at least in principle, could exist without the brain. So he says that even in our case, I, a simple entity without parts, controls quite a bit of my brain, a complex entity. And Swinburne doesn't discuss the complexity suggested by omniscience itself, all these ideas that I've been rabbiting on about. So I'm delighted that Swinburne and Dawkins have interacted, as they're both influential figures, but it's a very perfunctory interaction. I think it's fair to say that neither really understands what the other's on about. Well, I suspect that Swinburne does understand more, but he doesn't discuss it in great detail. That's probably a fair way of putting it. So, can I do any better? Will you be the judge of that? Let's look at this complex correlates of consciousness problem. I think it would be a big ask if I said you've got to believe in mind-body dualism of human beings in order to believe in God. But I don't think you do, because whatever's true of us, it doesn't seem to be a conceptual truth that conscious power depends on complex correlates. So we don't need to think about brains in order to understand explanation in terms of reasons and choosing a desirable option. I think most of us do that intuitively. We don't bring brains into it, and probably, and I think this is supported by some psychological studies, children are quite happy to ascribe brains and intentions to clouds, trees, flowers, and things like that, and human beings were as well. So it doesn't seem to be part of our concept of an intentional explanation, and an explanation in terms of a mind with purposes and choices, that it has a brain behind it. So even if it's true of everything in the physical universe, it doesn't have to be true of God. And indeed, as we've seen, the hard problem of consciousness is that conscious intentionality resists reduction to a mechanistic explanation. They seem to be completely different conceptual worlds. So the prospects for explaining conscious explanations in terms of mechanism are very dim at the moment. And you could say, well, that means that God is unlike every intelligent being that we've had experience of in the world. But that doesn't seem to be fatal, because God is a fundamental explanation, and scientists, particularly when they're dealing with fundamental reality, often have to postulate unseen things that are unlike all the things we've so far seen. So quantum mechanics is deeply odd, deeply unusual, unlike the things that we normally experience. But if you need that to explain the data, then scientists are prepared to postulate it. So I don't think the complex correlates of consciousness problem is all that serious. So you can't prove that God is complex because he has to have a brain. God's knowledge of creation, I think, can be explained because God would know creation simply by being aware of what he's chosen to create. If you've got a range of ideas and you know that you're choosing to make one of those ranges, one element of that range real, then you know that it's real simply by knowing what you're doing if you're omnipotent. And God could make what he makes, cause more knowledge in his mind if he wanted. So you don't have to say that God's knowledge of creation is unexplained. You can offer a deeper understanding of it. And this choosing is modelled on our own choosing among desirable alternatives. In other words, it's a familiar, intuitive explanation. It has explanatory appeal. So that, of course, raises a huge problem of what about the range itself? God can't choose to create the range because he needs the range to choose an option from among it. Is that clear? So they can't result from God's choices. They're necessary for God to make choices. But traditionally, God's mind doesn't think new things up. It grasps everything in the process of knowing his own limitless power. So if you know that you've got the power to make a house, then you have the power to know what a house is. Okay? God has that knowledge currently, presently, all the time. So he knows everything simply by knowing all the options. And he knows all the options simply by being aware of his own power. They're the same thing. Does this awareness of unlimited possibilities suggest design or Darwinism? Do we need an explanation in terms of design or Darwinism to explain God's awareness of all these possibilities? Well, to answer this in the negative, I'm going to appeal to something else Dawkins says, which I think is quite helpful. So this is a picture of Mont Blanc, pardon my French. Complexity without selection. So Dawkins says that there are some things that are complex in the everyday sense of that word because they have many parts. As you can see, Mont Blanc certainly has many parts, but Mont Blanc doesn't have organised complexity like a 747 or an organism. It doesn't really matter how those parts are arranged. You get something mountain-shaped anyway. It doesn't do much. So you can have things that are complex but are not exhibiting organised complexity. And I suggest that God's consciousness is something like that. So a 747 or an organism has a very specific, limited set of parts that are arranged in a very specific way. But God's consciousness, as you remember, is unlimited. So in that respect, it's very unlike a 747. And as a whole, God's consciousness isn't arranged in any special selective way. God knows it all at once. It doesn't matter where the ideas are or how they're arranged or anything. And so it seems to me very unlike what we find in an organism or a 747. The initially plausible analogy between God's mind and the human mind, I think, begins to look less and less plausible, that they're just so different. And fundamentally, of course, I wouldn't accept that the possibilities in God's mind are separable, rearrangeable parts, but we'll come on to that. Even if you think that ideas are parts, I'm saying, God's got a lot. He hasn't got a select few arranged in a special way. Does God's awareness contain complex creation? Why should it? Why should God's awareness contain complex creations? Well, it contains everything. Of course, it's true that chance won't produce complicated arrangements if the probability is very low. But if you've got more samples, more attempts, then the chance of getting a particular arrangement increases. And God's consciousness, we've been saying, has an unlimited variety of possibilities. So the overall probability of you finding somewhere in God's consciousness the right arrangement isn't low. So chance of getting a royal flush is very low. If Wikipedia is right, then it's that, so it probably isn't that. But if you were dealt unlimited hands in poker, you'd be certain that one would be a royal flush. So I'm saying, analogously, as God has unlimited possibilities in mind, you can be certain that somewhere one of them is the valuable one, and then being conscious of that, he can choose that on the basis of its value. So it's not improbable that unlimited consciousness of possibilities would contain ideas of complex things. After all, the low probability is outweighed by the unlimited number of ideas that we're postulating. And Dawkins' arguments from improbability are always assuming finite numbers. He's working with the universe, which has, I don't know, 10 to the 60 particles or something. So, piffling low numbers. So we come to the question, which isn't so Dawkins-like, of the Occam-Razor problem. Are there infinitely many ideas, and therefore infinitely many entities? And are we multiplying entities ad infinitum, and therefore violating the Occam-Razor idea that we should have simple, few numbers of entities? Well, I think when you think about it, despite what Hume says, ideas aren't independent, separable entities. You don't find ideas floating around and then arrange them into a mind. Ideas and minds are logically related far more intimately than that. And so if God's ideas are actually not separate parts, but are all aspects of one great infinite sea of consciousness, they're irreducibly holistic, then they're not independent entities. They're just different ways we think about one simple entity. And God's mind is therefore not like a universe of ideas, if that suggests that ideas are like physical objects in a physical universe. And indeed, Hume expressed deep dissatisfaction with his own analysis of the mind. He never came back to it, but he thought that his empirical term hadn't come up with the goods. Not, I hasten to add, because he'd come across this argument. But for related reasons. I think you can see there's something fishy about seeing a mind as something like a physical object or an idea. So I'm saying that God need not require complex correlates of consciousness. God's knowledge of creation can be explained in terms of his choice among valuable possibilities. He's got the range of ideas in his mind, and he chooses one on the basis of its value. God's awareness of possibility is unlimited, so it's not organised nor selective, so it doesn't invite explanation in terms of a designer or Darwinian evolution. And it's irreducibly holistic, by which I mean it's not composed of separable or rearrangeable parts. The various possibilities are just different aspects, the way we think about this one simple range of consciousness. So behind this, I think, is a deeper question which Richard Dawkins is linking into, but he narrows down. And that's, which is a better fundamental stopping point for explanation? And this shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's certainly not comprehensive. But I think you can see why God might still seem appealing, even if you buy fully into a scientific picture of the world, not dissimilar to Dawkins. You might still want to go the extra step and postulate God, because the fundamental physics, the most basic scientific theory, will have deeply obscure, non-intuitive properties if quantum mechanics is anything like on the right track. Whereas God will have familiar properties, intuitively attractive ones that we're intimately familiar with in terms of choice. And fundamental physics will plausibly have finite limits and values in there somewhere, even if it's dealing with infinites. There'll be particular mathematically expressible ones and not others. And there'll be values of pi and fundamental constants probably. God, of course, doesn't raise the question of why are those particular limits, because he doesn't have finite limits. The mind-body problem is a big problem, and it may be less of a problem if you think that behind reality is a mind. A mind without a body could bring it about that certain physical things do have certain mental aspects. Of course, we don't know what the fundamental physics is, but it's probably not going to be something that's simple to specify in the sense that God is. That, of course, is a bit of a statement of faith, but we can talk about that. God, it would seem, can be specified or defined in a way that ties down all the variables quite swiftly in terms of pure unlimited conscious power. And if the explanation of our reality and existence involves some sort of multiverse, then in some sense it would seem to be a composite physical fundamental. And God, we're saying, doesn't have to be seen as a composite entity. A mind can be seen as being irreducibly holistic and not composed out of little atoms. So that's why I think that God isn't complex.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, who would like to tackle this subject with Patrick? Any questions? Yes, Dennis.
I have two questions, really. I'll start off with, I think, which is a simpler one. From what I understood, would you then say if God is indeed the only sort of Cartesian ego without body in existence you can conceptualize, would that then lead you to accept the idea of the German romantics, that actually creation becomes the objective form of God, which stems from the subjective God, and that actually man becomes a sort of reflection again on the subjective God without body from the beginning?
This is deep, isn't it? I'm sorry if the talk isn't that clear. I don't think the issues admit of a totally lucid explanation, but I'll do my best to try and clarify myself. I think if we bring in Descartes, for example, there are dangers because a whole load of intellectual baggage may be smuggled in, and you may think that I'm saying something that I'm not. Descartes is, of course, our sort of token dualist, but there is a long tradition going back at least to Plato that's clearly dualist in a strong sense, and Platonism had far more influence on someone like Augustine than Descartes did. So I don't want to commit myself to anything that's or Cartesian rather than Platonic or any other form of dualism or Aristotelian. Okay, so that would be my first proviso. It would seem to me that it is part of the tradition to see all reality and creation as somehow reflecting God. And it's hard to understand what the medievals are getting at, but I think it may have something to do with the fact that if God has in his mind all these ideas of creation, then everything in reality that God creates must in some way reflect God because it's come out of his mind. Okay? Now, there's another thing. I'm not a great continental buff, and so I don't have a good grasp of German idealism or anything like that.
But you're an expert. Sorry.
Expert, yeah, sorry, I can't follow me. Yeah, I'm not a great expert in continental philosophy, so I may well be saying things that are deeply mistaken and crass, but even in England, there have been people who've been tempted by the idea that you could see all reality as more of a sort of mental thing, as an idea, than as a physical thing. So there's a sort of tradition of idealism, and it might look attractive that if you've got God, the fundamental reality, being a mental reality or something like a mind rather than a physical body, then all reality might be like that. And, you know, we exist in the mind of God, okay? But it would seem to me that the Christian tradition has always affirmed strongly the reality of God's creation and its distinction from God. So if God has created physics and matter, then that really is something different from God. It's not just an idea in God's mind, and we're sort of little ideas walking around in God's mind, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I don't think the German Romantics meant actually that
I'm
reality. But actually,
yeah.
they said, but no, I just asked because it seems to tie in very well with what you say. You know, God is mind without body, and then he creates a universe, obviously from real matter, and then sort of becomes in and for himself, in the end, through worship, in a way. So I just want to remark that because it seems to tie in very well with what you were saying.
Yeah.
And the second question I have, as I understood your lecture, you're actually saying it's best to conceptualize God as sort of infinite intentional possibility. Right?
Yeah, an unlimited intentional consciousness, yeah. Power.
Couldn't you get there by actually sort of looking at complexity and simplicity in a dialectical way? Because if you take the concept of complexity, which is more and more elements working together, infinitely almost, and you get, you know, more function and more purpose. When you draw that line any further, of course, you know, more and more complex systems become parts in other more complex systems. And you end up eventually with a whole system which is simple because it all works together in a complete way. And then, of course, you go back from simplicity to complexity. And actually the only way to sort of escape from that, you know, ever-enduring dialectical movement to that infinite possibility you suggested.
The importance of sort of dialectic and having two apparently different things and producing a synthesis does have roots in the sort of Christian tradition, which I think I'm sort of giving you the basics of. I don't think I'm saying anything original. I do think that if you look at the Christian tradition, you can see that a lot of what Dawkins is saying and a lot of what modern atheistic thought more generally is saying doesn't really tie in with the intellectual tenets and traditions that Christianity has had. And the sort of stress on dialectic and synthesis may have something to say, but I think that it no longer has purchase on someone who is brought up in the natural sciences, is thinking more naturally about the brain than the mind, and if there is a mind, at best it's sort of strongly emergent, and at worst it's somehow identical with the brain. So I think you could be saying important things, but I'm not expert enough to really tie them down. But the danger is that everybody's going to end up confused, and I would like to say that you need to concentrate on modern natural science because it's dynamic, it's selling lots of popularizing books, and it potentially could really change the the sort of cultural framework of Europe and America. So that's where my focus would be. And I don't personally think that the sort of notion of simplicity that you seem to have in mind of everything working together is a helpful one. In fact, I suspect that Dawkins is seeing God as something that all works together, but that sort of functional unity is just the sort of thing that Dawkins thinks needs an explanation. We find lots of functional unities in the physical world and in our mind as well, and Dawkins thinks those need an explanation because he naturally sees them as composed of parts arranged in a very special way, and normally as the product of evolution. So I think what you're saying is interesting. It's probably nowhere near where Dawkins is at.
Yeah.
Yep.
I've just realised kind of where my problem lies with this, and it's actually through Wikipedia. I've looked at that Wikipedia thing and I thought that's wrong, and I've just run it through and I think it's actually out by an order of magnitude. Now, in that case, it's kind of irrelevant just in that context because you're comparing it to infinity anyway.
Yeah.
But it's made me realise that the problem I've got with this isn't with any particular part of the argument, but it's an order of magnitude bigger. My problem is, what is the justification for asking this question in the first place? Because you're basically asking, is God complex? And in a certain sense, that means you're trying to ask, what is the nature of God? And I suppose the analogy goes that you can't ever completely understand the watchmaker by looking at a watch. Very much heightened by the fact that we're not even looking at the watch, we're a tiny part of the watch. And if we're one tiny little cog in this watch, and we can't even explain the watch, how can we actually hope to ask about the watchmaker? And so I suppose the question I'm asking is, what is your justification for actually asking the question in the first place?
At this point, one appeals to the mega book sales of the God delusion. I mean, this question is being asked, and as I pointed out, it's been asked at least since David Hume, and probably a lot earlier than that. And what you say is very important, and it ties in with the sort of dialectic that you can have a very stark statement from one theologian, and then another theologian will come along and say, but strictly speaking, everything isn't like that. And so that there's a powerful tradition in theology of saying all our language about God is at best analogous, and it's usually truer to say that God isn't this than it is to say that he is. Okay, so there's a strong agnostic strain in orthodox theology. But what Hume does is he has one character, Cleanthes, who's arguing strongly from design in the natural world, and he has Demia, who offers much more abstract arguments. And Hume plays them off against each other. And I think what he's suggesting is that you're either stuck with an argument from design which gives you a God who's made out of bits, and a really anthropomorphic idea. That makes clear sense, but it raises with a vengeance, well, what explains this sort of God? Because he's so like the things he creates. But if you go the other way, the sort of unspeaking, apophatic, negative theology, then you're left with nothing. Philo accuses Demia in the end of being an agnostic or an atheist, because he's not really said anything. If you start negating everything you say you can't ask that question, you can't inquire about the nature of God at all, then there's actually nothing positive you can say. And if you can't say anything positive, well, you might as well shut up and get on with the business of normal life. If God is going to have any purchase on our lives, then it would seem that we've got to say something positive about him. And of course, day-to-day religion is saying loads of positive things about God. So I think certainly some of Dawkins' supporters accuse Theists of changing the subject, and Dawkins is attacking the sort of popular God, the God who actually does things, who answers prayers, who hangs around in churches. A few sophisticated believers come up with some idea of God who Dawkins' arguments miss, but they're not really talking about God as popularly believed. And they're probably not saying anything meaningful at all. So as a good Anglican, I try and find the middle way where I'm still saying something about God that could make a difference. He could provide some sort of explanation that you have some sort of analogous familiarity with. But I'm not saying that God is like the organism, the watch, or the Boeing 747. So you've got to avoid the gross material analogies while not negating everything and being left with nothing at all, if you see what I mean. So the question has been asked from time immemorial. It's particularly pressing in its sort of God would have to be complex form, because Dawkins is selling a lot of books on this, but it's out there, and theologians try and tackle this because that's what human beings do, I think, a lot, unless they're distracted by other things.
Ruth has a question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because that was running through my mind as I heard the talk, and I thought, well, actually, maybe it's less like a cog asking about the watchmaker, but more like a student trying to understand the founder of the university, or like a kid writing an essay about their parent, where they probably write some terrible, disrespectful things, but the parent's going to read it 10 years later and think, oh, that's so cute. Sort of, I don't think there's any harm in trying to postulate what God's like, because I think if there isn't, I think because we're not a cog, we're made in the image of God, and Christians, many other religions, people made in the image of God, and there is a communication there, a revelation there.
Yeah, I think most religions would want to say that there's some sort of relationship we have with God, and the major theistic ones are going to say that we have something that is capable of personal relationship in God, and if you negate too much, you're not left with anything.
So my follow-up then has to be, where do you draw the line between, on one hand, having this idea that we are free and should try and examine the nature of God, and on the other hand, kind of thinking we shouldn't go too far and try and almost go down the lines of trying to explain God too fully? And where do you kind of draw that line in the middle?
Maybe presumptuousness comes in at some point.
Yeah, I mean, again, Dawkins is interesting on this because he comes out of context with a quote from Augustine that's warning against futile curiosity. Dawkins obviously takes that as a red rag, because what gets him out of bed in the morning is asking questions. And because it's true that in religions there's a sort of stress on humility, stress on mystery, that there are obscurantist, anti-intellectual movements, and some of them are quite powerful, and I think Dawkins fears that they've got their hands on the, lose the metaphor, that they have undue influence in the White House, yeah? So where you draw the line has to be one of the deep questions of theology, but there is clearly a danger of knocking away serious questions, because Dawkins is saying the emperor has no clothes. There is no God. When you look at it with some wit, with some intelligence, you'll see this is balmy. It's barking mad, he says. Okay? Why has that meme propagated? It's because there's another meme that says, oh, don't ask the deep questions, futile curiosity. And he's right. That meme is there. Of course, memes may not be a helpful metaphor. You can call them dogmas or influential charismatic pastors. There are loads of there are loads of dangers out here, but I think Dawkins will not be very satisfied, and those who are attracted by him, the people I was interviewing for theology, some of them are intellectually curious, to be told, don't ask that. That's probably going to send them in a different direction from Christian theology.
Good point. Yeah.
I was struck by the first comment you made from Dawkins' connection between complexity and improbability. And it seems like his discernment of that is based on his experience of contingent existence. That link is based on his experience of the contingent existence. Whereas, should that link necessarily relate to something like God, if he is this necessary being? So let's say there is complexity with God, or not, the simplicity, I actually bought your simplicity argument more. But if there's a complexity, and it's improbable, well, I hope it would be for God. I mean, God's an improbable thing. There's one of them, one God. So is it fair to apply that criteria based on his observation of nature, contingent nature, to God? I don't know.
Okay, again, I think this probably does show that different people approach from different presuppositions. I think you're exactly right that Dawkins, like Darwin before him, is deeply impressed by biological complexity. Yeah? And, Dawkins is quite respectful of Paley, just as Darwin was, influenced by him, read him quite a lot. Okay, so that's where they're coming from. That's really what animates them, and I think it does lead to a slightly crude anthropomorphic view of God. But the deeper thing is that for Dawkins, God almost certainly doesn't exist. So it's deeply annoying when these theists come along and say, let's assume there is a God. Aha, you're asking who made God. What a silly question. Can't you see God is necessary? You've just started from a place that Dawkins sees as so implausible. So, you know, if you're going to empathise and love your unbelieving neighbour, you've got to get into their mindset. And so I would say, if you're going to say that there's a factually necessary complex God, he's complex in some sense that's very different, admittedly, from biological organisms, but he nonetheless is in some way, you can see him as composed of parts. And you've got to ask, well, you know, how can you swallow that?
I guess I was
And
more,
why do you need to? We've got super Darwinism doing all this job.
I was more emphasizing the necessary part, that if you don't have that, you run into these problems of infinite regress. And how does he deal with that, or does he even talk about that? You know, this idea of you need not just a cause, but who's uncaused at the very well, not at the very beginning, but eternally.
You mean you haven't meditated on the God delusion today? There's no hope for you. No, seriously, I apologise if the humour is incongruous. The question of the infinite regress, Dawkins is live to that, but he thinks that God is a massively improbable infinite regress terminator. Okay? He's aware of arguments like Thomas Aquinas's, which say, look, everything has a cause, an infinite regress of causes doesn't explain anything, so there must be a first cause. And I think actually he finds that reasonably plausible. What he doesn't accept is the sort of second step of the cosmological argument, which is, and this is what all people call God. Now, interestingly, he's not alone in that. When you get students coming up to read theology, they've usually studied the 5 ways, but not the next part of what Thomas writes, where he offers arguments that what these arguments are pointed to is best explained by this simple being God. So there's a stage 2 in Thomas and a lot of other theologians that is gone. You know, people aren't studying it. So they see, and this is what all people call God, as a sign that Thomas and the rest are balmy, dyed-in-the-wool faith heads who are just swallowing what they've been taught. You know, they're better than that. I don't think Thomas's arguments are that persuasive, but you know, he is at least aware that you need to move from first cause to something that is like the Christian God. Yeah. So, and I think that's where I go with it. I think Dawkins is prepared to say that there's something is unexplained. You know, something's the unexplained explainer. It's just, it's nothing like what most popular believers have ever thought was God.
It interests me, if I can sort of get my own one in just briefly, is to do with, you're saying that he seems to accept the multiverse idea. Well, if he's doing that, he seems to be breaking his own rules in a sense, because this appeals to evidence. You know, you believe things on the basis of evidence, and Christians are these faith heads who believe things without evidence. So, you know, isn't he kind of somewhat, you know, isn't it a rather desperate move in a way for him?
Well, I think there are signs that he thinks it is a bit suspect. He says that cosmology hasn't yet had its Darwin. We don't have a crane that does the heavy lifting at the most basic levels of physics yet. So I think he is aware that there's a problem. But I repeat, he thinks that the multiverse is complicated more in the way that Mont Blanc is complicated. It isn't organised, but now, is there any evidence for it? Well, I think the evidence is that we're here, and that requires some explanation, okay? Why does it require some explanation? Because you have to have these very finely tuned constants. Well, how can you explain that there are these finely tuned constants without invoking
But that's a
intelligence?
metaphysical explanation, not a scientific one.
Well, I'm not sure that Dawkins is the expert on where you draw these lines. I mean, I'm teaching grandma here, but I mean, it is true that cosmologists talk about multiverses. It's in there, in the scientific community. It's a naturalistic explanation. You yourself admit that it does in some way, well, it does at least seem to help reduce some of the massive fine-tuning.
Yes.
You see that we're just in the local bit that has the right bit. So here you have something that explains some evidence that is patent, we hear, and you need to explain that, and it's got some basis in physics, so it's not completely away from the evidence. It's not with the fairies, and he thinks it's much better than God. Yeah, I mean, the reasons I've given,
Yeah.
he's wrong.
Yeah.
But I can see where he's coming from, and you can see, isn't it true that most cosmologists are going to be more tempted by a multiverse?
Well, if they want to avoid God, yes, they go for an alternative metaphysical rather than scientific explanation. Yes.
Yeah, so he's not alone. He's in keeping with where most of the intellectually well-armed people are in physics.
Yeah.